So I'd like to officially welcome you here for our final summer gathering at Uptuxet. Wonderful to see so many faces here, and I know for me, this week, the storminess, that incredible thunder really put me in the mood to hear storm stories. So this talk couldn't be timed any better. It's really wonderful to have this presenter. Don Wilding, I think anybody on Cape Cod knows him. He's sort of the king of Cape Cod shore lore. He wrote the shore lore
newspaper column. Thank you. The word.
The shore lore column for how many years?
7 years, almost
years.
6 or 7 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
And is an incredible storyteller. He's got his books here. We had him here last year for the book Shipwrecks, which is a really good one. He's an amazing speaker as well. Historian, storyteller, author, the whole works. And this is nice that we have a sneak preview tonight of an upcoming book. So lots of times when we have Don, we're lucky enough to have him with a new book, but we're going to get in before the book is even published, and he's going to talk about, on this sweltering, lovely hot night at Uptuxet, he's going to tell a chilling tale of another storm from long ago. So I'm very pleased to introduce Don Wilding.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Can you all hear me okay, first of all? Very good. All right, the Portland Gale. People always ask, what is the Portland Gale? It wasn't named so much for the city, it was named for the steamer that went down, and I'll get to all that in a minute. But the Portland Gale of 1898, here on Cape Cod, it was a night to try men's souls. It was a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. It was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery. It was a night of agony and of death. And it was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. So to give you an idea, my last book, Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, covered 43 shipwrecks over the course of 300 plus years. Here on Cape Cod, especially with the Portland Gale, there were dozens of shipwrecks, plus plenty of more destructive events that happened, all in one weekend. So just all what happened with this storm. To give you an idea of some statistics, during the fiscal year of 1897, there were 394 shipwreck disasters nationwide. And during the Portland Gale storm, there were 187 wrecks alone. So that was according to the Boston Sunday Post. When this storm struck and the destruction that it left, it made headlines all across the country. From one end, from here to California, the headlines were out there talking about the search for the bodies, the destruction that happened here on the Cape. And you see here, at this point, they had counted 99 lives. It ended up being more than that. Go out with the wrecking of the Portland. I get the feeling here that the editor who was writing the headlines was not from Cape Cod in the San Francisco paper, because he writes steamship dashed to pieces on the rocky shore of Cape Cod. No, didn't work out that way. But the saying about this storm, this is the storm that set the mark, really. You know how we all talk about the blizzard of '78, how bad it was? Well, this is how people were with the Portland Gale. This was the one that all other storms were measured by for a very long time. And the old keeper of the Wood End Lighthouse in Provincetown remembered it many years later, and he said there were many old timers left who are still willing and eager to settle down and begin their story. It was in '98 when the Portland went down. So when this storm occurred, it claimed 141 vessels off the northeast coast of the United States. 40 of those vessels were from Cape Cod. Overall, 456 lives were lost at sea during that storm. And as it was approaching, they were expecting a storm, but as is often the case, it doesn't end up being, they're not expecting a record-setting weather event. Well, this one was a record-setting weather event. Earlier in that afternoon, a fellow named Alfred Nickerson, he ended up being rescued at sea. He was a Chatham guy. And he had said at 2 p.m. that afternoon, the ocean was smooth as glass, but the sky looked awfully funny. It had a shiny, glassy look to it, and when it started to blow, oh boy. Ben Eldridge, he was another surfman at the Monomoy station outside of Chatham. He said he was outside doing a bit of washing that day, and he looked across the bay and he said there was this queer blue light over everything. The men were strangely quiet, not a joke among them. Even the gulls were hanging around the flats, and they were not screaming. They were quiet. And in Boston, at India Wharf, the steamship Portland was getting ready to leave for its daily run to Portland, Maine. There were 2 steamers that ran regularly from the Portland Steamship Company. They were the Portland and also the Bay State. So the Portland was due to leave Boston. The Bay State was due to leave Portland. It never left because of the weather forecast. Now things got tricky here on the night of November 26th. This was Thanksgiving weekend, and a lot of people were boarding the Portland to get back to Maine following being in Boston for the holiday. And this was a really well-known vessel. Everybody in Boston knew it. They all knew what the Portland was. They all had a chance maybe to get a look at it. Very stately, very luxurious type of vessel. And everybody knew about it. And it was supposed to leave Boston. Well, it actually did leave Boston at 7 p.m. And its track was to go past Salem, past the North Shore, and up to Portland, Maine. Well, this storm hit right after the Portland left Boston. And as it was going north, it was spotted along the North Shore, well up until about close to midnight. After that, nobody's sure what happened, why it went out to sea. The winds were hurricane force at this point. But it ended up out over the bay around 3 a.m., and then it kind of drifted down towards Cape Cod. And again, nobody's really sure what happened. It ended up sinking over Stellwagen Bank. That's where it is. Now the remains of it sit in 460 feet of water. So the forecast was for a pretty severe winter storm coming in. And so people were aware of what was going on. But the plan was for Captain Hollis Blanchard, who had just been recently promoted. He had these warnings and everything. He knew there was a storm coming, but he figured he could beat the storm as it was coming in. He could beat it up to Maine. There was also the problem is they were competing against the railroad for passengers and for freight. So they wanted to get this run in if it was at all possible. Now, as to who okayed this or who made the decision or who was pressuring who is not completely certain. He had received this weather report that had a storm moving in from the Midwest. Problem was there was another one coming up the coast. They did not take into account that these 2 storms would merge and, as they like to say now, bombogenesis off of the coast. The storms merge and it basically explodes into a monster storm. And that's what happened here. And Blanchard, he was a guy, he was a frequent visitor to the Weather Bureau office in Boston every day. He went in and checked in with them to get all the details. And in the past, he was actually called out by his bosses for being a little too careful. And so he may have taken the chance because he felt pressured by his bosses. And what he encountered was more than what anyone could have imagined. Isaac Small wrote a book called Shipwrecks on Cape Cod. He was the lightkeeper in Truro for many, many years. And he said, such was the force of this hurricane that every window pane on the ocean side of our house at the signal station at Highland Light was blown in and smashed into 1,000 fragments. Men exposed to the full force of the storm were blown from their feet and hurled around like blocks of wood. So you're basically looking at a winter hurricane here. And Small had recorded a wind gust of 90 miles an hour at Highland Light during that storm. There were higher gusts recorded elsewhere on the Cape and in New England, on the coastal New England. Joshua James was the keeper up at the Point Allerton station in Hull. He's legendary in Coast Guard and life-saving service circles for how many people he rescued. And James estimated that out at sea, he rescued quite a few people, including some Cape Codders in this storm. The visibility was maybe 100 yards at best. So when you're out at sea and you're fighting against these odds, you don't have much of a chance. Within 2 hours of this storm beginning, by 9 o'clock, from Casco Bay to Martha's Vineyard, there were 200 ships that were scrambling for cover. They were trying to find a place to shelter. So the Portland, as it's moving up the coast, it couldn't shelter around Newburyport. That was one of the things people asked. Well, why didn't he bring it back into port after setting out? Well, that turning around is actually a pretty difficult thing to do with a steamer like this and bringing it into shore. There was some thought that he might try to go out to sea and ride it out or try to get to Provincetown Harbor. But the winds switched around to the northwest. It kind of just pushed him out to sea. And by Sunday morning, there were reports that the Portland might have been spotted off of Cape Cod. So a lot of people on Cape Cod, what is the Portland doing out here? And one of them was Captain Sam Fisher. He was the keeper at the Race Point life-saving station out in Provincetown. And he heard from close offshore these bells and whistle blasts that were believed to be from the Portland, and also that's the sign of distress. And he couldn't see the ship really through the snow and the squalls and the sea spray and everything. He could hear it, but after a while it vanished, it stopped. And he had actually prepared his crew to go and do a rescue, but there was no one to rescue at that point. Some concluded later on he heard another cargo ship, a steamer called the Pentagoet. It was formerly a revenue cutter and a Civil War gunboat. And it had a crew of 18 bringing cargo of freight, and including Christmas toys, up to Maine. And they last saw that around High Head and Truro. And some speculated it might have collided with the Portland, along with some other ships may have also done that, but nobody's ever been really able to verify that. There was also a fishing boat called the Ruth M. Martin. The captain was Michael Francis. And Michael Francis Hogan. And he was caught offshore with his crew on a fishing trip, trying to get back to port. And he said that he and his crew saw this large steamer, side-wheeled steamer, through the snow and everything. And they said that they saw it for a couple of hours, and they think it was probably the Portland, but they couldn't be sure. There was also a ship called the Mary A. Tyler that was coming from Maine, heading south. And its captain, Alan Bragg, was fighting for his life, basically, and the ship. And as they were passing by the Cape, or close to the Cape, he said he had told his daughter many years later that they were so close to the Portland that he could have touched it. They almost collided with it. And but he said there was nothing they could do because they were trying to hold on for dear life as well. And I'll get more to Alan Bragg's story in a little bit. This image here might give you, this was not from the Portland, but this gives you an idea of what the scene might have been as the Portland was being tossed around in its final hours, with the floodwaters coming in and the people struggling to stay out of the water. At 7:30 on Sunday night, the night after the Portland had left, almost 24 hours later, John Johnson was a surfman at the Race Point station, and he recovered a life preserver out on the beach marked Steamer Portland while he was out on patrol. And then the next few hours, much more debris from the Portland started coming ashore. And at 2:20 in the morning, on November 28th, first body was discovered by a surfman named Gideon Bowley. He was from the High Head station up in Truro, and the other bodies soon followed. There was another body from the crew that was recovered in Wellfleet, and over the next few hours, several more. It was over 3 dozen bodies from the crew, from the entire ship, which had about 200 people on board. And many bodies and pieces of wreckage also came ashore in the Nauset area, Eastham, Orleans. And this was written by Alice Lowe, who wrote a book called Nauset on Cape Cod. And there were tales told of carting of bodies to the railroad station, and distressed relatives waiting anxiously in the Cape Towns for their loved ones to be released from the angry seas. The outlines of other vessels glimpsed offshore during the storm were known to be lost. Their wreckage was also littering the beach. Dr. Maurice Richardson, from the same Richardson family that gave us Wyman Richardson, House on Nauset Marsh, and Elliot Richardson from the Washington scene. He was down at he was a Bostonian, and he was at his summer home in Wellfleet during this storm. And he saw 2 bodies wash ashore, and also a lot of other cargo and things from the Portland. And of the bodies that had watches on them, each one of them, the time on their watches was at 9:15. So they're not sure if it was 9:15 at night or 9:15 in the morning, but this is evidently the time between 9:15 and 10 o'clock that the Portland went under. This was a whole list of some of the bodies that came ashore in Eastham. This was roughly 8 or 9 bodies came up, and it was 38 bodies total that came up on the outer beach of Cape Cod. And that was those were the only ones, too, that came ashore. Everything else, a lot of the bodies are probably still underwater with the Portland. A fellow wrote to me after I wrote a column about the Portland in the Shore Lore column many years ago, and he told me that his great-grandmother had always talked about the Portland when she was young, and she told him about the bodies that they found on the beach in Eastham, and that those were all brought to the funeral home on Bridge Road in South Eastham. And that was soon filled up, and they had to put whatever bodies were left in a barn nearby because the ground was frozen and covered with snow, so they couldn't really bury anybody. So it became a very grim and dark affair very quickly. There was a story from at the time, a young Edwin Horton from Eastham. He was only 13 years old at the time. But he had heard this story, and he told it later on, that one of the Nauset Station lifesavers had gone down the beach looking for victims. And he found a body. And he went over to the body, and he turned it over, and to his shock, the man was alive. Now, this is how the story goes. I find it kind of hard to believe myself. But because if that ship went down over Stellwagen Bank and he survived in icy water for all that distance, I don't buy it completely. But anyway, as the story goes, he was getting ready to run to get help, and the man said, "For God's sake, don't leave me." And the man ran to get help. And by the time he got back, the guy was dead. So if that story is true, it would be the only account. Somebody would actually know what really happened with the Portland. But there aren't too many records left from what was on board. Later on, a few months later, March of 1899, there was a fishing schooner called the Maud S. The Maud S had actually spotted the Portland off of the North Shore during late that night. And they pulled up parts of wreckage near Stellwagen Bank that came from the Portland. That ended up, the company verified that yes, these did come from the Portland. So these were supposedly the first pieces found by the Portland. Many years later, the writer and historian Edward Rowe Snow also went on many expeditions and ventures to try to find more evidence about the Portland. He did have put together a group of people that got together every year to observe the disaster. These were family members that got together for many, many years. There is a plaque now at Highland Light, too, that you can see if you ever go there by the lighthouse, that is dedicated to the memory of the victims of the Portland. And these are some of the images that were taken of the Portland by NOAA's Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary and Klein Sonar Associates in 2002. The vessel was first found in 1989 by John Fish and Arnold Carr and a group they had put together looking for shipwrecks, and they found the vessel, what was left of it. It's in 460 feet of water in Stellwagen Bank. So this is in a national marine area. You can't really, it's a sanctuary, you can't really go on board, take anything from it. And also, to go down 460 feet is pretty dangerous. The pressure is just too much. So this anyway is what is left of the Portland, and what's below the surface there, nobody really knows and may not ever know, because just getting in there is too much. So here on the Cape, it ended up being a disastrous scene. If it was happening today, there'd be news crews, and the Weather Channel would be all over the Cape right now after something like this happened. In Provincetown, this was one of the disasters that happened. This involved the Wood End Station at the far end of Provincetown. And their keeper, Isaac Fisher was his name, and his crew took 10 hours to reach the distressed Lester A. Lewis and Jordan Mott. These were two vessels that were in trouble in Provincetown Harbor. The entire harbor was filled with dozens of ships that were getting thrown around like toys by this storm. And these two vessels were half submerged. Crew members were up in the masts, hanging on for dear life. And they first spotted this vessel very early in the morning. About 6 o'clock in the morning, they ventured out to try to get through the snow and the sand and the flooded beach and everything. And to get out there, it took them 10 hours. And if you've ever been out and saw Wood End Light and then the rest of Provincetown Harbor right there, on a normal day, it would take you an hour or two to walk to that area. But it was just so much that they had to go through in terms of, elemental fury and snow and floodwaters, that it took them that long, including having to go through a 50-foot wide channel of water as they're trying to drag a surf boat to this rescue. They got to these two boats that were both from Maine, and these 5-man crews. There were 10 men total on both ships. 6 of them were frozen to death. The gale began early evening, light snow and wind, and increased by 11 o'clock. And by Sunday morning, the boats were piling up in the West End. For a little historical context, this is also where the Mayflower first anchored when it came to America. And this is also the area where now there is the breakwater, the big stone breakwater that's over there. That was not there at this time. This was 13 years before that was constructed. So the surf was also up to the back door of their station out there. So these two ships they find out in the harbor. The surf is just tossing and turning everything all over the place. And the men on board the Mott, the companions of some of the sailors on board that were actually beating these men, some of these other men, to try to just keep them from freezing. That's how bad things got. The captain's father was the steward. He was already dead. His body was up, encrusted with snow up in the masts. That's what happened a lot. Sometimes these men just froze to death. And So the lifesavers took 4 survivors off that. The Lester Lewis was not much better off. They had 4 men in the rigging. They were all dead. Another was dead in the cabin. And they figured, the other ship, they figured these guys just gave up after a while. And this was a couple of days later after everything had calmed down. And there was a woman, she was only identified as Mrs. Henry Spears. She lived nearby, right near the harbor, and could see out the window onto the harbor. And she saw them cutting the bodies out of the Jordan Mott's rigging. And from that time on, she kept the shades drawn on every window that faced the harbor. She just couldn't look out there anymore. And meanwhile, on the other side of Provincetown, on the back shore, this is around Race Point, just the Race Point, out actually east of Race Point, the schooner Albert L. Butler came ashore. It was actually around the Peaked Hill Bars area. Those of you not familiar with that, the Peaked Hill Bars is this notorious area off of Provincetown of sandbars offshore that goes out maybe at least a mile. Very treacherous for any ships that were in the area, especially during a storm. They were carrying logwood from Jamaica to Boston, and the storm drove it ashore. And by the time that the surfmen from the lifesavers got there with their apparatus and surf boat, the ship was about 50 yards offshore. It was pretty close. So one man, they shoot this line for a breeches buoy. This was kind of the zip line they would use to haul people off of ships. Well, the guy on board the vessel didn't know what it was for, so he just grabbed the rope and jumped in the water. So they had to pull him in through the water, and he survived. But a couple of other people on board tried it. Didn't work. They didn't make it. They ended up drowning. And 2 men later on, after these other people were brought ashore and the tide went out, 2 men appear on deck coming out of a cabin. They were in the cabin the whole time. And they start to come ashore, and one of them had a big parrot on his shoulder. And they said the parrot had had quite the salty vocabulary, but the parrot also said something that they all agreed on. He said, "That storm was a real humdinger." So even the parrots got in on it. It wasn't just in Provincetown Harbor either that these horrible things were happening. Also down on the Vineyard, in Vineyard Haven. The Boston Globe summed up a situation, "tossed like toys" was the description of what happened in Vineyard Haven Harbor. The most eventful day the Vineyard Haven is known for 40 years. The port was strewn with wreckage. Vessels were constantly driven ashore, many of them dashed to pieces. 50 coasters were thrown around the harbor, half of them washing ashore. 2 men drowned. A British schooner was driven into the wharf near the Seaman's Bethel. And Seaman's Bethel was almost taken out by a ship that was being thrown around. And there were 2 lime schooners from Maine, the Bertha E. Glover and the E.G. Willard, and they were trying to get anchored. And the Glover took on water, and when you're carrying lime, you don't want that. That causes lime to ignite a lot. And so this ended up being, the ship caught fire, and it was smoldering. And it stayed that way until December 19th, about 3 weeks later, before it went out. And across the harbor, the E.G. Willard also caught fire. And the men of the Willard, they had a big decision to make, either burn or drown, one or the other. So things got pretty bad, and then there was a schooner called the J.D. Ingraham, and it was on the loose, like many of the other ones in the harbor, heading straight for the Willard. And so these men are on board. What do we do? So one of the sailors said, from the Ingraham, says, the lime schooner was on fire. The peril of her crew was greater than the danger we were in. And when the 2 vessels fouled, all on board the Rockland schooner jumped aboard the Ingraham. They had no more than struck the deck than the two hulks broke apart and each vessel went on its own course to destruction. So they managed to jump off of this burning ship onto this other ship that's also in trouble. So there actually managed to be some survivors from that. There was a vessel called the Island City that came ashore at Cottage City, in Oak Bluffs section. And people could still see these men up in the rigging, just not too far offshore. And one newspaper report said one of the men was seen hanging from the rigging by his heel, head downward. The bodies were picked up on the beach. They gradually froze and just dropped one by one off of the rigging, off of the masts. There was a schooner called the Amelia G. Ireland, captained by a Wellfleet man, James Lombard. And it was out in Menemsha Bight. And one man died, 5 more died nearby aboard the schooner Clara Levitt that went to pieces shortly after striking the sandbar. To give you an idea of what was going on for the Gayhead lifesavers during that period, from November 26th at 11 p.m. until November 28th at 5 p.m., they were continuously on duty. One shipwreck or one thing after another. Many of these wrecks involved many repeated attempts to rescue them in this horrible weather. The description out of Provincetown was from a Portland Daily Press reporter, said that these surfmen, they worked like fiends. The sand cut their faces until they were raw and bleeding. And during that same storm, one of the Provincetown rescuers had to thwart a wind that swept sharp, fine sand through the air, smothering streaks that cut like the strokes of a whiplash. That's what it's like when you're out there in sand when it's blowing during a storm. And the men of the life-saving service were absolutely exhausted by what they had to go through those couple of days. They were totally unnerved by it. Their nightly contact with, quote, disfigured and unfortunate victims thrown up at their feet. And one of the surfmen, Ben Eldridge, said, "Terrible week we spent. Sometimes we could just see a hand sticking up in the sand. And when we dug, of course, we'd expose a body." And it was always one of the lifesavers' duties to transport those bodies to the proper authorities for burial. And one reporter asked a surfman from the Peaked Hill station about it, and he told him gruesome details of finds that he had made and the method of carrying the dead to the station. And he says, "Well, isn't that rather hard on the nerves?" And the surfman just said, "We can't think about that. They're somebody's friends." The Boston Post said that nigh 300 souls were lost on that awful night, but you did your best, to the lifesavers. You are the heroes of the blizzard. Some of you toiled all night alone. Some of you walked up and down the wreck-strewn beaches. Some manned the boats. Some secured the save at station houses. All are heroes. So it wasn't just the lifesavers who were busy. Up in Provincetown, again, there were many volunteers. Captain Robert Lavender was a veteran captain from Provincetown. And he grabbed a whole bunch of his seafaring friends, veterans from the sea, and they ended up being awarded the Congressional Medal for Bravery for what they did during the storm. They rescued a man called William Forrest from the rigging of a schooner called the F.H. Smith in Provincetown Harbor during the storm. He's in a crowd, Lavender, and he says, "Men, we know that there is one of us out there in the rigging. It's a life, mates, and I'm going to try to get at him. I call for volunteers." So Lavender and 10 men dig up this old leaky boat, and they get it out. They fix it up enough and get it out into the harbor. And Lavender gets knocked out very quickly by the surf. And he says, "Don't mind me, boys, keep her going. I'll make sure, all right." And they say, "Like the devil you will." And they pulled them back on board. People are on shore watching this and cheering them on. And the masts are just about to give out when Lavender and his veteran friends got to the Smith. They said to him, swing clear of the shrouds in gear and let go. And he dropped into the water. We said, we'll get you. And they did. And they pulled him ashore, got him into the boat after all that. So the news getting to the mainland was rather slow to happen. Nobody really knew even what had happened to the Portland. There were rumors that the Portland had actually docked in Provincetown Harbor and was there and safe. And other rumors had it breaking up on Peaked Hill bars. It was neither. But many reporters were trying to get the right story. They were all over the place. You talk about a media frenzy. It was going on. And there was a reporter he was a correspondent for the Boston Herald out here. His name was Charles Ward, lived in Chatham. Ward had he had picked up a portion of a telegraph message from Highland Light to Hyannis that all these people had perished aboard the Portland. And Ward finally gets enough information together where he thinks he has a story. And he gets to East Sandwich somehow aboard a train, and the tracks are blocked by snow. And then he borrows a horse from a local farm, somehow after banging on the guy's door in the middle of the night, and rides it to Buzzards Bay. Then he manages to get a train that's running all the way up to Boston. He gets to the Herald office, staggers up the stairs, and gives the news to his editor before he loses consciousness. And then he's on the floor, and the editor's over him, hanging over him with a bottle of whiskey, ready to say, come on, give me more. Tell me more. There was another one, too, for the Boston Globe. His name was Frank Stanion. And he had his own problems getting in a story. This is a few nights later, actually, when another storm had come through. But by this time, there were reporters all over the Cape. Stanion used an unusual relay system to get his story in. He was getting names of victims. And so a lot of these reporters were staying at what was called the Shattuck House in Orleans. And Stanion was in there, and he was wondering, how am I going to get this list back to Orleans? The phone lines are down from this new storm. And so he's out walking in Orleans, and he walks past this building, and he hears what sounds like a telegraph key. Well, you can guess where he might have been. He was right outside the French Cable Museum, well, the French Cable Station. It's now a museum. But he could hear this clicking telegraph, and he goes inside, and he runs into this Englishman in charge of a French cable station named Hugh Osborne. He was the superintendent. And they weren't doing a heck of a lot of business because the telegraph line from New York wasn't working. And in a matter of seconds, as the description goes, the message went from Orleans on Cape Cod to St. Pierre and Miquelon, off of Canada, French territory, then under the Atlantic to Brest, France, then to London. And then from London via British Postal Service to Ireland, roughly 2,500 miles back to Nova Scotia, and then down the coast of New England into Boston. That's how it worked. He got his story in. So they had 2 towboats from Boston in Provincetown filled with newspaper men, just all looking for stories all at once, interviewing anybody they could get. And only 2 hotels in town were crowded they were filled. And a lot of reporters, too, hired horse and carriage teams for transportation, especially going out to those life-saving stations out in Provincetown and Truro. And one reporter described, he said, we came upon at the undertaker's room an unidentified woman thought about to be 50 years old. She had a cruel cut on her head. That was evidently caused by contact with a piece of wreckage while in the water after the steamer broke up. And he also reported that these tales were sickening and painful to listen to. We could not but shudder at the terrific tales of this horrible storm. And a lot of relatives of these victims were starting to come onto the Cape by train once they finally got the tracks moving again. And they couldn't. Some of them couldn't find their relatives. They were going from town to town at the undertaker's rooms, trying to find any evidence of their relatives. Some found them, some didn't. Railroad tracks were washed out in both Truro and in Sandwich, so that closed off the service for many days. They actually had this little. I don't know how well you can see this here on the right, but the had to sort of ferry these people by these coaches along the sand dunes from one break in the track to the other to get them further down the Cape. At Town Neck between Sandwich and Sagamore, 3 to 4 miles of track were washed out by these very high tides. They described it as a tidal wave coming off of Cape Cod Bay, more like a storm surge. And also 300 feet of track in the Brickyard at West Barnstable. And they reported this tidal wave coming in. It wrecked several fish houses, and one of them was stranded right on the railroad track. And these are views from downtown Sandwich. Churches damaged, houses unroofed, chimneys thrown down, several barns and small buildings demolished. And you couldn't get through the streets. There were those giant elms and silver oaks that were all taken down. The storm just blew them right over. A lot of livestock was lost too. Houses were surrounded by water. One family ended up getting rescued by a boat. This one on the right here, I'm told, is actually the Daniel Webster Inn. And the roof is very badly damaged. Buzzards Bay, section of Bourne. A windmill was blown down, the roof blown off an ice house. A shed was carried into an adjoining field. Out in the bay, a 35-foot cat racer flight. It was famous in Beverly Yacht Club regattas, according to the Barnstable Patriot. That sunk on Cleveland Ledge. And the tower of the Methodist Church in Catawmet was blown off, replaced in August of 1899. Falmouth. Wind and snow created mayhem. There was a story in the Falmouth Enterprise that a milk wagon was coming up Main Street, blown over with horse, wagon, and driver landing in a snowdrift. The house that was known as the Vineyard Lodge, the summer retreat for Edward N. Fenno, a prominent wool businessman, saw large trees in front snapped off like pipe stems. 300 trees were blown down in Woods Hole. And another at the estate of businessman Joseph Fay, over 150 trees blew down, large windmill overturned. And this story out of Dennis, this was really tragic. The night of November 22nd, 4 nights before the storm, John D. Garfield, a captain from West Dennis, and a friend of his, Captain Mark Holmes of Connecticut, they were dining together in Philadelphia. They were getting ready to come back north with their loads of coal. They had become really good friends over the years, and their two vessels would actually sail together on many occasions. And 96 hours later, after that dinner, the two mariners, they were together again. Not in a manner they expected. Both were lashed to the masts of their respective ships, dead, at the bottom of the ocean off of Montauk Point, Long Island. Garfield was the captain of a schooner called the James B. Pace, and Holmes was captain of the Howard M. Hanscom. And November 24th, both vessels are being loaded with coal. Garfield and the Pace are headed for Boston, Holmes and the Hanscom for Providence. And nobody knows what happened to them, at least for the time being. Days and weeks passed. The December 1898 edition of the New York Maritime Register reported the Pace as overdue, followed by several months of missing status. Now, Garfield had a wife and 2 kids, 5 sisters, 2 brothers, back in Dennis. The first mate, Danny Nickerson, his wife was taking care of an 8-month-old son in Dennisport. And as the days and weeks passed, any optimism for the Pace's survival was going away fast. And a year later, government divers are out in the ocean, and they're investigating what was called navigational obstructions at the bottom of the seas off Montauk Point. And they discovered the Pace and the Hanscom. And the details were that in both vessels, the divers report skeletons of men were found lashed to the rigging or to the rails of the vessels. While there's nothing left of the flesh, it's thought they could be recognized by the clothing. So they couldn't even really tell. It was really hard. There were other mariners who were much more fortunate, such as Captain Alan Bragg, who I mentioned earlier. Captain Bragg, they often say about wash-ashores. I mean, most of us are probably wash-ashores. This guy was a real wash-ashore. Bragg was, they say you can trace your family archives back to the Mayflower or whatever, and you're a true Cape Codder. But he became a true Cape Codder, and by living to tell the tale, really. He was on board the Mary A. Tyler. He was the captain of this vessel, carrying paper from Maine to New York. Broke in two, and it's stranded near Paynes Creek in Brewster. Bragg was from North Carolina, and these guys, as the shipwreck victims often did, took to the rigging when they felt they were in trouble, because that's what happened here. This vessel was in big trouble, and they're in the bay, and they're all up in the masts. And they ended up being rescued by Captain Jeremiah Wixon and other men from Brewster later on that morning. The descriptions that he gave to his daughter back in 1971, grimly, he and his men worked to keep their own ship afloat. Just before night fell, as the terrifically high and pounding waters off Cape Cod, his boat broke in two, the forecastle remaining just enough above water to allow the men to try, but in vain, to light a blaze, however small, for warmth by pouring kerosene on coal. They had a few water-soaked soda crackers, but they were too frozen and sick to eat. They tied themselves together with a rope, and after hours of struggling with the wind and the icy deck, managed to lash themselves to the mast. All during the frozen night of horror, the wind whipped the mast into the sea, tossing it up and down as though it was more than a splinter, freezing them to it. Their clothes were iced to their bodies. They were vomiting and nearly unconscious. The wind abated somewhat toward morning, and after daybreak they were spotted from shore and brought ashore. Captain Bragg later told his daughter that for a long, long time the tides brought in the rolls of paper from that wrecked ship, which the natives gathered, dried, and used. Apparently it was also used to print the Brewster School newspaper for many years. And that wasn't the end of the story. Bragg ended up marrying Wixon's daughter a few years later. He was taken to Bragg's home initially. He would visit the family quite a bit after that, and then he decided to stay, married Wixon's daughter, Margaret. And his life at sea didn't really end with the 1898 Gale either. During World War I, he was a lieutenant commander for the U.S. Navy, led some of the largest transports of the war. During World War II, he worked for the government as a civilian in charge of a Michigan shipyard, which built small boats. And his memory lives on at the Captain's Golf Course in Brewster, where the second hole on the starboard course is named for him. This was a very busy fellow during the course of the storm. His name was Dr. Samuel Davis. He was the medical examiner for Cape Cod during that time. He was described as being a most untiring official. His district embraces all of the Cape Cod shore, where every hour finds the body of another victim of the terrible storm. He was from the Vineyard originally, settled in New Orleans in 1878, stayed there for 30 years, and then was appointed the local medical examiner in 1898 during the summer. So when this happened, with all these victims coming ashore and all these people searching for their loved ones, Davis requested that photographs with a full description, age, color of hair and eyes, whether the person wore a beard or mustache, if so, what shade, marks upon the body, jewelry of any kind if worn, clothing, description, full, complete description to accompany all photographs, and these must be attached to the picture. And he said letters had been pouring into him since that Tuesday after the storm, 100 a day. And the requests for information tell of the tremendous sorrow the entire New England states are weighed down under. A lot of these were coming from Maine. And Davis told the authorities, move all the bodies to Boston as soon as possible. That was, the state police and the undertakers were very helpful in that. And this also created quite the hectic scene at the Orleans train station. Other things washing ashore, this big old double steering wheel, 6-foot double steering wheel from the Portland, came ashore in Orleans. Had a 200 feet of line attached to it. And it was found by this old salt here, Rufus Snow, a local captain. And he started taking this double wheel all over New England, Boston, showing it off, exhibiting it, until he went to Maine. And then the Portland Steamship Company had it seized with a cease and desist. And they told him, and they also had it destroyed because, it hurt their business, is what it said. One of the bodies that was found close to the holidays, sometime in December, actually it was probably earlier in the month, it was a young man that they identified only as Clarence by a writer named Helen Freeman Stevens. And later on they found out the name of Clarence's name was actually Clarence Rogers. And he was out walking on Nauset Beach in Orleans a few days, about a week or so after the storm. He's going down the beach. He spots the body of a young lady, probably about his age. Clarence is about 20. And she's wearing only a white nightgown and a black stocking. That's it. And he's stunned. He goes over, covers her up with his coat. It's a fairly mild enough day. And then he runs back to town from Nauset Beach to get to the local undertaker. And so the undertaker gets his cart, goes down to the beach. Clarence is riding along. And it was noted that for some strange reason, perhaps because the victim was so near his own age, perhaps because the discovery had been his, this happening held for him a horrible fascination. And back at the undertaker's office, local officials scrambled to learn the girl's identity. And they chose a casket. Clarence was the one who actually chose it. And they said, well, if that's the way youth sees it, why not, was their reasoning. And they had this all ready to go, and then relatives from Maine came in to claim the body. And they didn't particularly like what Clarence had chosen for a casket. So they chose another one. And throughout the winter, this morbid fascination continued. Clarence came by the undertaker's office on occasion to regretfully view the casket. Later that winter, Clarence got sick. He came down with a cold. In January. Into February, it evolves into pneumonia. And it wasn't long before he died. And following his death, they had a choice to make a choice for the casket. And they all agreed that the coffin he had picked out for the girl was the most appropriate one in which to bury him. And later on, also, I might note that after Clarence had been buried, his dog would keep going up to the tomb, it was described as, in the cemetery in Orleans. And he would sit there every day just kind of waiting for Clarence to wake up. So it was even more gruesome things happened afterwards. But the newspaper described it, what a beautiful sight it was. There was also a poem written about the loss of the Portland. And that's what it was called, Loss of the Steamer Portland. Captain Frederick R. Eldridge and hydrographer George Eldridge, no relation, I'm told. 326-word poem opened with the lines, on the 27th of November in the year of 98, a northeast blizzard swept the sea, death following in its wake. And that summer, it was made into a song. And it had a pretty big impact on a visitor from New York guy named E.W. Blanchard. Yeah, Hollis Blanchard, the Portland's captain, his brother. And he was staying at the Monomoyuk Inn in Chatham. And it was reported in the Chatham Monitor that Blanchard drove about town with George Eldridge, and that Mr. Eldridge sang to him the Song of the Portland, which affected him very much. So this storm, legendary still to this day as to what it did and the lives it claimed and the heroism of many of the people here on Cape Cod. But it was pretty well noted in a composition written by a young woman who was actually, her name was Annie Newcomb, and many years later it was published in the, this composition was published in the Provincetown Advocate, and she referred to it as the terrible event which rested so heavily on the hearts of many and which will not soon depart. So I'd like to thank you for coming here tonight for more grim weather details after yesterday's events. And just let you know that I have some other events coming up. Henry Beston's Cape Cod, about the outermost house author. I'll be in Orleans at the Centers for History and Culture in Orleans, also known as the Orleans Historical Society, tomorrow night at 7:30. I'll be signing books at East Ham's Windmill Weekend, September 10th. Cape Cod Storm Stories at the East Ham Council on Aging, September 30th. October 5th, I'll be talking about Cape Cod lore at the Crane Library in Quincy, also at Brooks Free Library in Harwich on October 8th at 2 p.m. It's not included here. And this same talk will be at the Sandwich Public Library on October 13th. For more information, you can log on to dwcapecod.com. I have several social media pages as well. And yes, I have books here. The Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898 is coming soon. I'm told it will be sometime in the spring of 2023. And I have my other two books here, Shipwrecks of Cape Cod and A Brief History of East Ham, $21.99 each. And, well, there we go. Anybody? Thank you.